When such government abuses take place, they do not end with the other, or with the weakest link in society. Let us never forget the saying of Pastor Martin Neander over 65 years ago. When the Nazis came for me, for the communists, I remained silent. I was not a communist. When they locked up the socialists, I remained silent. I was not a socialist. When they came for the trade unionists, I did not speak out. I was not a trade unionist. When they came for the Jews, I remained silent. I was not a Jew. When they came for me, there was no one left to speak out. The threat to civil liberties anywhere is a threat to civil liberties everywhere. For the catalyst of how we got here, the challenge we now face, and the response to whose time has come, I direct your attention to the screens before you and the NCPCF video, Civil Freedoms.
The formation of the National Coalition to Protect Civil Freedoms is the fulfillment of a dream that I've had since 2007. And I'd like to start by telling you a little bit about how I come here tonight. I'm a retired lawyer. In 2006, I was part of a defense team representing an imam in Albany, New York, Yassine Araf, who was charged with material support for terrorism. At the trial, the government failed to produce any evidence that Yassine had said or done anything illegal, and yet he was convicted. Afterwards, I realized that the government had deliberately convicted an innocent man. I'd never encountered this before in my professional life. I felt humiliated that my country would dishonor its legal system in this way. We formed a group in Albany to take care of families of Yassine and his co-defendants, which included 10 young children. Taking care of those children, driving them to see their father in jail, raising money to pay their rent, attending graduations that their fathers had to miss, helping the children to survive the crushing poverty into which they were thrust, taught me about the real human devastation of the government's programs. They put Yassine in a mostly Muslim prison in Terre Haute, Indiana, called the Communication Management Unit, designed to isolate prisoners from their families, their communities, and the world. The government included a few environmentalists and a few animal activists as balancers, so that they could say that the CMU was not just for Muslims, but everybody knew why it was there. To visit Yassine and with his wife and 4 children was a 5-day round trip from Albany, New York. And I saw the torture damage caused by solitary confinement. On one visit, after Yassine had only been a few weeks in solitary confinement, I found him crying, shaking like a leaf, and so unable to talk that I could only hold him in my arms to comfort him. I saw how prisoners try to hold themselves together, support each other, and stay strong in the face of this heartless oppression. We became aware of many similar cases all across the United States. Dr. Rafiel Dafir in Syracuse, Fahad Hashmi in New York City, Samuel Larian in Florida, the Holy Land Foundation in Texas, the Virginia paintball case right here in Virginia, the Fort Dix 5, the Newburgh 4, and many, many others. I bring this roll of names to my NCPCF events to remind people that we're not talking about abstract principles. We're talking about real people and real injustice. Several people have written to me and they've said, my appeals are exhausted and there's nothing I can do legally. Please, put me on your wall. I don't want to be forgotten. And I've taken this responsibility seriously, so that we will never forget the prisoners and their families. In 2009, we formed a group called Project Salam to document all of these cases and to advocate for the victims. Lynn Stewart was a keynote speaker at our first conference. We gave a name to what the government was doing: preemptive prosecution. That is, convicting targets of contrived thought crimes and manufactured charges supposedly before a real crime could be committed. The government used acts of charity, peacemaking, and free speech to convince people of material support for terrorism, convict people of material support for terrorism. And when they could not find a charge, they would manufacture charges by entrapping targets in government stings run by criminals and agent provocateurs. It was Dick Cheney's 1% doctrine in action. You remember that? If there was a 1% chance that a person might engage in terrorism, then the FBI had to act as though it was a certainty by finding an excuse to lock the target up. And the logical extension of that doctrine is that it would be better to lock up 99 innocent people than allow one potential terrorist to go free. There are your 99 innocent people. That's the result of this policy. That's why they're convicting innocent Muslims, and why they're locking up some of them in isolation, where they cannot even communicate with the outside world. Some prisoners were held in solitary confinement under SAMs, special administrative measures, for years under conditions amounting to torture, until the defendants were forced to plead guilty in order to escape the pain. We started a database, which now has almost 800 names in it, and began to assemble the facts about each case so that someday we could free the prisoners and right these injustices. We even developed a theory on how we can do this. In 2009, the Inspector General of the Justice Department reported to Congress that prosecutors had no mechanism to identify surveillance evidence which showed that the defendants were actually innocent. He recommended that all terrorism cases be reviewed to identify those in which the government failed to disclose evidence of the defendant's innocence, as required by law. We were sure that if the Department of Justice made such disclosures, most of the terrorism cases would collapse because the cases were never real to begin with. They were just thought crimes and manufactured charges. Many, if not most, of the defendants could be released. But how could this happen? How could we accomplish this? The Department of Justice was ignoring its own Inspector General's recommendations, and by ourselves we had no power to force the Justice Department to obey the law. And then a remarkable thing happened. In August 2010, we were invited by the Ilarian family to come to Washington and meet other groups that were engaged in similar struggles. There were national civil rights organizations, national Muslim organizations, local Muslim immigrant and peace groups that were all struggling against this erosion of civil rights from both the Bush administration and the Obama administration. Individually, we did not have the capacity to reverse this erosion, but collectively, we had a chance, and so our coalition was formed. Since the erosion was caused primarily by the federal government, we recognized that only a national organization with political influence in all the key states could bring enough pressure on Congress to change the laws. We built our coalition around three campaigns: elimination of preemptive prosecution, profiling, and prisoner abuse. We created a separate organization to draft and promote the kind of legislation that we wanted to see passed by Congress. But Congress was in partisan gridlock. In order to exert enough pressure on Congress, we had to start first at the grassroots level. We created an education committee to hold events all across the country to expose the dirty secrets of the preemptive prosecution that the government is trying to hide. Last year, members of NCPCF traveled to dozens of cities, from San Francisco to Boston and from Chicago to Tampa, teaching about our three campaigns and laying the groundwork for an expansion of our grassroots organization. We created a legal committee to build the best database in the world about preemptive prosecution cases and to create new and better legal theories for defending against fake terrorism charges. We created a media committee to challenge Islamophobia, the narrative that is in the media, and expose the hypocrisy with which the government smears Islam to justify its wars abroad. And most importantly, we created a prisoner and family committee to ensure that no victim of repression is forgotten, left behind, or uncared for. One of our first projects was a nationwide survey of prisoners and their families to determine their needs and situation. All of this work was done mostly by volunteers, many of whom were not even compensated for their expenses. We are adding new members to NCPCF daily. We have opened our first chapter in Albany, New York, and we are in dialogue and discussion with several other cities. and we are confident that the DC area will provide one of our next chapters. We have grown enormously in the last year because we offer a unique voice to the country. We are a combination of Muslim and non-Muslim organizations, all speaking with one message. We are all Americans, and we are all entitled to be treated equally. An injustice to one is an injustice to all. No other organization brings peace activists, Muslims, immigrants, civil rights advocates all together to create such a broad grassroots movement for civil rights. What we need now is financial resources, frankly. Money to pay expenses of travel to different cities, money to hire administrative staff, money to create a new narrative that stops scapegoating Islam. We need funds to publish information from our database, funds to restore prisoners and families to a safe place within their communities, and funds to reach more dues-paying members so that we do not have to rely on traditional fundraising. If we could get 5,000 members, each to pay $120 dues a year, it would amount to $600,000. That's more than twice our projected budget. Each generation is given an opportunity to make a contribution to build peace and unity and to push back against the forces that seek to divide us. Real security comes when we live in a country which respects diversity and is united by the law. Won't you please invest in your own security by contributing to NCPCF, and at the same time contribute to the peace and security of the whole country, and indeed the whole world. This is a struggle for Muslims and non-Muslims alike, and we cannot afford to lose. Thank you.
No words are descriptive enough to convey the human toll of preemptive prosecutions and the abusive conditions found in discriminatory communication management units, also known as CMUs, without a living example of someone who has experienced it himself, and can relate the effects on the prisoners and their families. To help us fathom the reality, we are especially fortunate to have Brother Abdul Ali, also known as Avon Twitty, who spent 3 years in the CMU in Marion, Illinois. Abdul Ali embraced Islam, embraced his Muslim roots in the late 70s while in detention, and came to learn how dangerous Muslims were perceived even while incarcerated. Brother Abdul Ali will tell us what CMUs are, what he and his fellow inmates faced on a daily basis, and the effects it had on him and his family.
Assalamu alaikum. These names and these pictures on this wall, we share something with them. First of all, they're human beings. Then there are Muslims. But I share something special with them. I was there the day that Dr. James Yee was snatched from Jumu'ah prayer and taken to the shoe. I was there that day when all he said was, do not sell the Muslims out. Do not share the secrets of the Muslims with the kuffar. Do not lie on the Muslims and help the Muslims get set up, and they put him in what's known as the hole. I was there that day. I was there the day that Brother Yassin Arif completed learning Sahih al-Bukhari, the whole 9 volumes in Arabic. I was there. Ali Mateen, I was there the day they locked him up, simply behind the fact that he didn't want to serve pork off of the child line. I was there that day. I was in the unit with these brothers. This makeup sale you see here is too pretty. It's too pretty. Number one, it's too big. You see the bed? I could not, it's a double bed in this cell. I could not put one hand on this side of the bed and stick this arm out. So the cell is too large. You need a black slime print running down the wall, because we believe they drilled the roof on us. In 2000, what was that, 2008, they had a serious rainy season in Terry Hut. I was not in Murray, I was in Terry Hut, Indiana, the old death row unit. The unit that was condemned because it was not fit for the condemned to live in. So they closed the unit down and moved them out and moved us in. A condemned unit. Like I said, the cell is too pretty. You need a toilet in there with the stains from you know what in it. Also, if you lived in cell 29, from 28 to 30, if I flush the toilet in 29, what I sit down the toilet comes up out of the cell in 30. This is regular because remember the building is condemned. Also, we have, I seen Saeed from our chaplain's name over there. I was there the night that Dr. Rafi saved his life. You see the officers, they escorted the inmate into the cell, right? But that's not how it's done. When they come, they have a shield this high. It's that high. And you have electric rods on that shield, and it's a trigger on it, and one walks right behind you with it, and he's hitting it. He's letting you know that the charge is there. And you have one officer, he has your arms like this right here. They don't carry you like that. One officer, your arms is like this. One officer sticks his arm through here and pull it up, and they bend you over like this. And that's how they put you in the cell. Like I said, the night that Dr. Rafi saved Saifullah's life, Saifullah Chapman is a diabetic. As punishment for being bad, they denied him his medication for 3 days. On the 3rd day, he went into a diabetic seizure in the cell. Around about 3 o'clock in the morning. The regular unit officers, they wanted to run in the cell and whip him. They had that shield that I was talking to you about. Most people call them a beanbag gun, the shotgun that shoots the beanbag out. It's a bag, it's about this wide, about like that square. They stick it inside this, what's known as we call it a hand cannon, to make it a little, it's around about this big. Now, if that thing hits you in the face, it's going to shatter your jawbone or your cheekbone. If it hits you in this part of your rib cage, it's going to break your ribs. And if it hits you square in the face, it might just break your nose and drive that bone back into your brain and you die. That's how dangerous that thing is. They call it a non-lethal weapon, but it is as lethal as it comes. They also have what's known as a pepper spray can about this large that shoots a serious pepper spray out of it. And if I shot it from here, I could spray that whole table with one shot. This is what they wanted to run in the cell on him, and this is what saved his life. All of us were banging on the wall, banging on the door, hollering and screaming that something is wrong with him. He's having a diabetic, he's a diabetic. And Dr. Rafi said, "We know where you live!" And that stopped him. That's what saved that brother's life that night, because they was going to go in there and whip him while he was laying in his own blood because he hit his head on the side of the wall. That's what saved his life that night. Soon as the medical staff came in the unit and they saw who it was, they automatically knew what was wrong, and they ran and got his medication, gave him a shot, and brought him right around. That's what happens in the CMU. They say that Islam is not directly targeted. How many of y'all know John Walker Lynn, the so-called American Taliban, Yahya? He's in that unit, and you would think that if he was getting written up, it would be for something serious. You know what they wrote him up for? They wrote him up for calling the adhan in his cell, and took him from the cell and put him in the hole. We also have a brother by the name of Bilal Ahmed. In fact, Ali and Ali Chani. Both of them went to the shoot for offering congregational prayer in the cell, 2 people praying together. Out of all the things that inmates could do, you're going to lock us up for calling the adhan. You're going to lock us up for just offering the salat.
Here is a light-heated yet extremely educational skit on what to do and not to do when the FBI comes knocking at your door.
Hi, how you doing?
Hello, I'm Special Agent Alan Chu. Mr. Ahmed Saeed.
Yeah, that's me.
I'd just like to talk to you.
That's me, that.
I I'd just like to talk to you for a couple moments.
Sure.
Some outreach and
Come inside, go ahead. Okay, just have a seat.
What a nice home you have here.
Oh, thank you.
Mr. Saeed, you're a member of the Dar al-Hijra community, aren't you?
Oh yeah, I pray sometimes, stuff like that.
And are you also a member of American Muslims for Palestine?
Oh yeah, sometimes I help out with their activities. I'm even helping with the chaplain there, but that's about it.
Do you also know an individual named Faris Mohammed?
Oh, I know the guy. He moved a couple years back. He's living in the area.
And when was the last time you were in contact with Mr. Mohammed? When was the last time you were in contact with Mr. Mohammed?
I haven't seen him for a couple of years. I talked to him on the phone once or twice or so.
Once or twice, but not anything in the last 3 or 4 months?
No, I don't think so. It's still once or twice.
Mr. Saeed, are you aware that it's a violation of federal law to lie to law enforcement officers?
I'm not sure I understand.
We have information to the contrary about your contacts with Mr. Faris Mohammed.
I don't think so. I just talked once or twice.
Thank you. You'll be hearing from us.
Okay. Hi, how you doing?
Hello, I'm Agent Alan Chu with the FBI.
Okay.
Mr. Ahmed Saeed, is it?
Yeah, that's me.
Would you mind talking to us for a couple minutes? We're doing outreach in the new neighborhood.
Okay. I'll just talk out here.
Could we go inside?
I'll just rather talk out here.
Are you sure you're not in any trouble? It's just a friendly neighborhood alone.
Yeah, that's nice. Do you have a search warrant?
No, we don't, but I'm sure you don't have anything to hide, Mr. Saeed.
Well, look, if you don't have a search warrant, I can get your business card, and go to my lawyer, and she'll contact you within a few days, and we'll just take it from there.
Listen, Mr. Saeed, we can do this the easy way or we can do it the hard way. It's easier if you talk to us now. We have everything, but we have only your best interests in our mind.
Look, like I said before, if you don't give me a business card, give it to my lawyer, she'll contact you, and we'll just take it from there. That's it.
All right, I'm sorry to hear it.
All right, thank you.
Honestly, how much did you just learn from that? Seriously, I'm going to go home and tell my family all of that. That's why skits like these are incredibly educational and important, as as simple as it may seem. This is just one of the ways that NCPCF educates and promotes civil freedoms at the local level. While on the topic of education, it gives me great pleasure to introduce a tireless advocate of civil liberties, who has been educating Americans on our collective rights and freedoms for many years. Professor Peter Erlander is a professor of constitutional criminal law and international humanitarian law at William Mitchell College of Law, St. Paul, Minnesota, and author of numerous academic articles, treatises, and commentary in domestic and international media. He is a past president of the National Lawyers Guild and director of International Humanitarian Law Institute. He served as defense counsel for several post-9/11 cases, including before 2 appeal courts for acquitted but then still detained Palestinian academic activist Dr. Sami El-Galian. Professor Erlander is currently serving as the chairperson of the board of directors of NCPCF. To introduce our keynote speaker, I welcome Professor Erlander.
In order to build a little credibility with you, I think that I should mention that not only was I Sami El-Galian's lawyer, but Sami El-Galian and I founded the National Coalition to Protect Political Freedoms in 1997, because as you may know, the National Lawyers Guild was declared a subversive organization in 1954. You see, we were the organization who defended people accused of being communists in the 1950s. We were the only organization that didn't require a loyalty oath in the 1950s because we believed that people had a right to their political beliefs during the McCarthy period. As a result of that, when the Clinton administration passed the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act in 1997, I began writing articles about how terrorism would be the new communism in 1997, because it was clear that at that time that terrorism would be used as a way to attack people politically in the United States as communism had been before. Unfortunately, that analysis proved to be true. Because of that analysis, Sammy and I began working to overturn the secret evidence laws that were used to deport people under the Clinton administration. We were successful in getting the repeal of the secret evidence laws on the congressional agenda. Bipartisan support was prepared to go forward on September 11th, 2001. We now know that that legislation was stillborn on September 11th for reasons we now understand. I'd also like to suggest to you that the period that we're in now is one that is significantly different than the ones we've been in past times. I'm going to suggest to you that there are 5 examples that are on the historical docket at this moment that our guest will also speak about, because he's been one of these singular critics who has made it clear that this is a new day for American civil liberties and for our Constitution. The question is, after 200 years of this, the world's oldest Republican democracy, whether the National Coalition to Protect Civil Freedoms is necessary at the beginning of the 21st century, and I'll suggest to you that it is, because the 5 reasons that are in the news now makes it clear that it is. First of all, we have Trayvon Martin. We know from Trayvon Martin that we have not gotten rid of profiling, because we know that Mr. Zimmerman decided who Trayvon Martin was before he even knew who the man was. We know also that the laws are written by the National Rifle Association to make it possible for somebody like Mr. Zimmerman to claim self-defense even though his life was not threatened. The laws are made by those who have power. Secondly, last week we know that Mr. West, the congressman from Florida, announced that there are 76 members of the Communist Party in Congress. Who are they? The members of the Progressive Caucus. So you see, the McCarthy period is not yet over. It's still possible to attack members of Congress as being beyond the pale as members of the Communist Party, even today. Thought crimes take place in Congress, even today, according to other members of Congress. A press conference scheduled 2 weeks ago by the National Coalition to Protect Political Freedom had to be canceled. The press conference was to announce that we had uncovered another manipulated case where the federal government was setting up Muslims with the sting operation in Pittsburgh. The day before that press conference was supposed to happen, old weapons charges that had laid around for years were used to arrest the Muslim brother who had exposed the sting operation. He's now in prison on those old weapons charges because he was willing to come forward to say that he had been set up by the same informants who had set up the Newberg case and cases in New York, and the same informants were being used to set up Muslims in Pittsburgh again. And because he came forward and explained that this setup was happening, they arrested him on some old charges that had been laying around for years. And of course, had he played a role that they wanted him to play, they would have used those old charges to pressure him to turn into an informant. And then, of course, there were the terrorists in Detroit who were non-Muslim, who had all sorts of weapons, who were doing paintball and all sorts of other direct activities in the woods, who were not terrorists at all because, of course, they were not Muslim, although they really had guns, they really were shooting people, and they really had a plan to take over the United States government by force, but they were not criminals according to the courts. And then we have the sentencing of Tarek Mahana of 17.5 years for translating a book in Boston. And our speaker tonight, Mr. Greenwald, quoted from his speech at sentencing for 17.5 years. He said in his speech at sentencing, "I learned one thing in history class. America has historically supported the most unjust policies for its minorities. practices that were even protected by the law, only to look back later and say, what were we thinking? Slavery, Jim Crow, the internment of the Japanese during World War II, each was widely accepted by American society. Each was defended by the Supreme Court, but as time went by and America changed, both people and courts looked back and said, what were we thinking? Nelson Mandela was considered a terrorist by the South African government, given a life sentence, but time passed and the world changed. They will look back on how the government spent millions of dollars to imprison me as a terrorist. Yet if we were to somehow bring back Abir al-Janabi back to life at the moment she was being gang raped by your soldiers, to put her on the witness stand and ask her who are the terrorists, she certainly wouldn't be pointing at me. The government says that I was obsessed with violence, obsessed with killing Americans, but as a Muslim in these times, I can't think of a lie that's more ironic. These events in the news now force us all to ask, what is our country coming to? Does it represent a country in which the rule of law prevails? All of these, and the list goes on, are acts taken under the law. I am a law professor. I am sworn to uphold the law, and the law makes my heart sink. A famous legal theorist, H.L.A. Hart, wrote in his book, Rethinking the Criminal Law back in the 1960s, what difference does procedure make if anything can be made criminal in the first place? And in his most recent book, Liberty and Justice for Some, Glenn Greenwald exposes the bipartisan thinking with respect to the rule of law and the limitations on governmental power that both Republicans and Democrats since 9/11 have essentially eliminated, and leading him to the conclusion that U.S. democracy itself, under elites in both parties, is under attack. And he points to many of the individual and systematic examples in which the privileged crimes of the powerful, crimes of the state, and powers of others that go unpunished, while relatively minor crimes and crimes of the disfavored put millions in prison. Now, my experience also has been in the international arena. Perhaps you will recall that 2 years ago, I was in prison myself. In fact, it was next month, it'll be 2 years. I was actually imprisoned by the CIA in Rwanda and was nearly killed. And I know from personal experience that the UN Security Council, international tribunals, apply international criminal law to the leaders of disfavored countries, while the leaders of U.S. allies and U.S. leaders themselves face no punishment at all. Killing 500,000 Iraqi children, weapons of mass destruction, and I can say from personal experience, the cover-up of the Rwandan genocide, which you have heard was done by the guys who lost the war because the guys who won the war said the guys who lost the war were responsible for the Rwandan genocide. You all know that, don't you? But the reason I was in prison is because I had the evidence that shows that the Rwandan genocide was the responsibility of the Pentagon and the State Department. And the reason I was able to get out of jail was that I faked a suicide in order to put Hillary Clinton in a position where she had to get me out of jail or answer the consequences. Now, the American people and the people of the world are facing a new situation. The American empire finds itself in decline for the first time in a century. And the temptation of the ruling elites of the sole superpower to use coercion, both internationally and at home, is certain to grow even stronger. And that is why the National Coalition to Protect Civil Freedoms was formed. It's a battle for democracy, and the rule of law in the United States is on the agenda. And Glenn Greenwald is a tribune for the American people in that fight, raising the call to the American people for a struggle that's gone on for 200 years, to make the promise of democracy and civil liberties real And it's a promise that we have to redeem for our future and for our children's future. Because while the Founding Fathers may have had some wonderful ideas that they promised to the future, they were also slaveholders. They also did not give women or men without property the vote. They did not believe that those who didn't own property could run the country or should run the country. And the reason we have democracy and the reason we have the rights that we can fight for today is because people who are ordinary people in the United States before us fought for those rights. They did not come from our betters. They came because ordinary people demanded that the promise be kept for them and their children. Glenn Greenwald is calling upon this generation to carry out that struggle so that the next generation can struggle too. As Frederick Douglass said, those who want freedom and justice without struggle are like those who want the crops to grow without the rain. It is struggle, not a sure thing. It's in our future. We know the future, nothing less than to learn the analysis that Mr. Greenwald has put forward and to learn from him how it is we have to struggle.
Approximately 2 weeks ago, there was an amazing article in the New York Times, or at least in the online version of the New York Times. And what was amazing about it wasn't so much what it said, but it was amazing because of who wrote it. It wasn't written by some Muslim activist or some radical lawyer or dissident or anything like that. It was written by Andy Rosenthal, who is the editorial page editor of the New York Times, probably one of the most mainstream and establishment media positions that it can be in the United States. And what he said in the first paragraph of his online column, he observed very matter-of-factly that the United States has created, quote, essentially a separate system of justice for Muslims. Has created a separate system of justice for Muslims. And the reason I say I don't think that's extraordinary because of what it said is because anybody who has watched the United States over the past decade knows that to be the case. It's not even in reasonable dispute or controversy that there is a separate system of justice for Muslims. What's amazing to me about it is the fact that somebody who is so mainstream and in such an establishment position can make that observation so matter-of-factly, but even more so that that observation of such a pernicious and extraordinary fact triggers almost no controversy or even notice. It was the proverbial tree that fell in the middle of the forest. Barely anybody paid attention to it or heard it. And that's why I'm so honored and delighted to be able to speak with you here tonight, because I really do believe that the coalition at its core, both the individual members that compose it and the coalition itself, are really devoted to correcting that extreme deficiency. Not just those injustices themselves, the creation of a separate justice system, but the fact that our citizenry has permitted it to take root and to grow for a full decade with such apathy and indifference. Now, I think there are a couple of ways to look at this development, that there is a separate system of justice for Muslims in the United States. One way to look at it is to simply view it as the latest in a long line of historical examples in which particular groups have been singled out in the United States to be demonized in order to keep the population's fear level high and to justify all sorts of power and authority in the United States government. There have been lots of groups in the United States historically that have played the same role. Immigrants played that role for a very long time. Japanese Americans played that role during World War II. Black Americans have played it for centuries. And for several decades, the role was principally taken by the communists. It was the communists that was the grave enemy of the United States, both foreign and domestic, that justified the endless war and militarism, constant surveillance, and the like. And as Professor Arlander alluded to, once the Soviet Union fell and there was no more communist threat to point to and to exploit and to use, there was a need for another enemy. And seamlessly, that enemy was created and replaced communism, and it was called the terrorist, and quickly in the public mind that became Muslims. And what's really remarkable about that is if you go back and look to American history in the 20th century, you can find all kinds of warnings from people about the danger that this was going to take place. You can look, for example, to the 1961 farewell address of Dwight Eisenhower, another non-radical speaker, the five-star general who commanded U.S. troops in World War II and then served as a two-term Republican president, who warned in his farewell address in 1961 famously that the conglomeration of private military industry and the U.S. government was creating what he called a military-industrial complex that would become even more powerful than democratically elected leaders. They would exist beyond the realm of accountability. And it's certainly gotten infinitely worse in the 5 decades since he delivered that address. And what he warned was that in order for it to perpetuate itself, it would constantly need to find the pretext for war and for militarism. And the prerequisite for that is to always have a group that the population can focus on in order to feel sufficiently afraid that it believes militarism and expanding government authority and an erosion of civil liberties is both warranted and necessary, so that the population not only accepts those erosions, but cries out for them, calls for them, and demands them. And so you can look at Islamophobia and the way in which Muslims have been demonized, and anyone associated with causes that are perceived to be Muslim in the United States as yet another iteration of this dynamic. And there is some truth to that. But the other way of looking at it is the one that I actually think is more persuasive, and that is that there is a lot of things unique about what is taking place in the United States with regard to how Muslims are used and exploited to justify these assaults. And I just want to make a couple of observations about why I think it is unique historically. And I want to begin by looking at what I think is a very remarkable paradox that has taken place since the 9/11 attacks. And the paradox is this. After the attacks on September 11th, I think it's natural to be expected in the weeks or months after the attack that the United States government and the American citizenry would react excessively to the threat. That is a normal and natural reaction for human beings to have, not just in the United States, but across the spectrum of human nature. You can look at human beings who are confronted by immediate threats and they often overreact. It's just a defense mechanism. So it isn't really surprising that there were all kinds of lines transgressed and all kinds of excesses committed during that immediate period in the aftermath. But we're now 10 years removed, more than 10 years removed, from the last attack, terrorist attack on U.S. soil allegedly committed by Muslims, at least that we know of. There was an anthrax attack after that, there have been other attempts, but that was the only successful attack committed by people who have been identified as being motivated by allegiance to a religion or a set of political views. And yet, 10 years later removed from that terrorist threat, one would expect that as the threat recedes, the demand for greater government power, the demand for more and more militarism, the demand for renunciation of core liberties would recede along with the threat. And yet the great paradox is that isn't happening. Exactly the opposite is happening. As we move further and further away from that threat, as it becomes less proximate in the public mind, the policies that are justified in its name, the assaults on core liberties, actually continue to intensify. Every step that's taken in this realm is always in the step of more militarism, more assaults on civil liberties, less freedom, more targeting of Muslims. It's because, as Dwight Eisenhower warned, the system has become self-perpetuated. Even when it has no real threat to justify itself, it finds and concocts threats. It continues to proceed and to grow and expand, even when the pretext for it no longer exists. And that's what makes it so dangerous. Once you go down that path, it's very difficult to remove yourself from it, even when the original justification for it has been confined. The second aspect that I think makes the threat even more difficult and more pernicious and dangerous and explains its uniqueness is that there has been a real shift in rhetoric and tactics and strategy in terms of how these civil liberties erosions are justified and how they manifest. So if you look at the 4 or 5 or 6 years after the September 11th attacks, the focus in terms of government propaganda and rhetoric and even policy was primarily on foreign threats. Al-Qaeda was the symbol of the threat that Americans needed to protect themselves from. These threats typically took place off of American soil. There were certainly lots of American Muslims in that initial period that were targeted in all sorts of ways, but the principal focus rhetorically and propagandistically was on things taking place outside of the United States. And what has happened over the last 3 or 4 years is that has completely shifted as well. So if you listen now to not just people like Peter King, but even high-ranking national security officials in the Obama administration, the emphasis that they constantly highlight is that the great threat to the American people is now what they call homegrown terrorism. Meaning terrorists who are not hiding any longer in Afghanistan or Pakistan or Yemen and Somalia, but who are American citizens or legal residents of the United States living and working on American soil. And what that has meant is that all of those excesses that were once principally focused outside of the United States are now being imported onto American soil, not on a case-by-case basis, but systematically. So that if you look, for example, at the recent intensifications of the civil liberties assault that I just described, you see things like the dilution of Miranda rights for people accused but never convicted of terrorism, or the enactment of a statute that took place at the end of last year as part of the National Defense Authorization Act to codify the practice and power of the government to indefinitely detain people, including on American soil, or the proliferation of sprawling surveillance programs directed not at foreign nationals outside of the United States, but at Muslim mosques and communities. You see the importation of these abuses from what they were in the wake of 9/11, which was taking place on foreign soil, largely but not exclusively, almost exclusively now in a very systematic way, onto American soil. And then the third factor that I would identify that really I think makes this unique historically is the following. I had this realization actually quite recently. I went to speak at a university in Indiana about the state of civil liberties and the war on terror and the Obama administration, and there were several high school students who drove from Kentucky several hundred miles in order to attend this event. And the reason that they did that was because they were publishing a high school newspaper that was expressing some views that the school administrators found politically controversial, and they were being censored by the school administrators, and they wanted to come and interview me so that I would say insulting and mean things about their school administrators, which I happily did, and they wrote an article about that. And yet, they talked to me after I spoke, and I had spoken about civil liberties, and I talked about the dramatic and radical changes that took place in the United States in terms of basic liberties and how the government functions after September 11th. And one of the girls who was in attendance, the high school girl who was in the 10th or 11th grade, said to me, you know, you speak a lot about this idea. Everything that you say is grounded in this concept that there was a pre-9/11 America where all of these freedoms and liberties were taken for granted and were natural, and now there's this post-9/11 America where these civil liberties have been eroded in the name of threats from Muslims. And she said, one of the things that is so important that I hope you think about is the fact that I'm 15 years old, she said. And all of my peers are 15 or 16 years old, and when 9/11 happened, we were 4 years old or 5 years old. So that the generation that is currently in high school and coming of age, and even entering college, for them there is no such thing as this pre-9/11 world where things were once different, and a post-9/11 world where things have changed. The post-9/11 world forms the entirety of their political consciousness. Which means that all of these developments that we call radical, for them have become normalized. And all of the ways that Muslims have been depicted in popular media since September 11th, for them is all they know. And that too is an extremely odious development, which I really focused on as a result of what she said to me, that I think makes this trend even more threatening in terms of how entrenched it is and difficult to combat. Now, one of the points that I wanted to make tonight has already been made extremely eloquently by Mr. Ali, by Mr. Downs, by this board over here, which is, it's very easy, I think, to gather in places like this or to write about these issues as I do almost every day and to become angry at these injustices but still think of them as an abstraction. And one of the reasons why I travel so much around to events like this, and one of the benefits that it really provides to me in terms of my motivation, is that it personalizes not just how intense these injustices are, but also how pervasive they are, how universal they are, especially among Muslim communities in the United States, but even among people who are engaged in any sort of constitutionally protected, dissident political activism. And I say that because almost everywhere I go, not by planning it, but simply coincidentally, I encounter people whose lives are affected in all sorts of devastating and horrendous ways by these injustices that we talk about in the abstract. So just on the trip that I'm currently on, I began on Wednesday in Ottawa, Canada, where I was invited to speak by the National Press Club at the Journalism University there. And Ottawa just so happens to be the place that Mahar Arar lives, who is the Syrian-Canadian citizen who was abducted by the United States in 2002 at JFK Airport and in collaboration with his own government in Canada, rendered to Jordan and then to Syria, where he was kept for 9 months in solitary confinement and brutally tortured, only for everybody to realize at some point thereafter that they simply have the wrong person. Although the person that they wanted has never been charged with any sort of crime or wrongdoing of any kind. And Mr. Arar has attempted to obtain justice in American courts and has had the courthouse doors shut in his face by virtue of both the Bush and Obama administrations insisting to courts that what was done to him was too secret, and that to allow him even to be heard in an American court would jeopardize the disclosure of state secrets. And I heard from him how he had a promising career as an academician. He has a PhD in engineering, and all of that has been sidetracked by virtue of his disappearance and his now 8-year-long battle to obtain some minimal justice for himself. He obviously has all kinds of emotional and psychological afflictions that he's very bravely spoken about quite openly by virtue of literally being snatched away by virtue of his religion and his ethnicity and brutally tortured in a place to which he no longer had any connection. And then after I was in Ottawa, I flew to Chicago and I spoke last night at the University of Chicago and was on a panel there, and I was invited there by the Muslim Student Association of the University of Chicago, one of whose leaders happens to be the son of Dr. Sami Al-Ari. His name is Ali, and he's a very committed and passionate University of Chicago student, and he happened to drive me back to my hotel after the event was over, and he recounted to me the extraordinary oppression and injustices that his father has been subjected to for the last 9 years, where the U.S. government has deprived him of his liberty for absolutely no reason whatsoever. And he talked to me about the effect that it has had on his father, who was a university professor at the time that this started, and his children, and the devastation that they continue to confront as a result of what Andy Rosenthal described as this separate system of justice for Muslims. And then earlier today, I was in Washington and I happened to have lunch with the brother of Guled Mohammed, who is the 18-year-old American citizen whose family arranged for me to call while he was imprisoned in Kuwait at the behest of the U.S. government, where he was interrogated and detained without charges and beaten and tortured. And I listened to this 18-year-old American citizen in extreme distress, as anyone would be, failing to understand why this has happened to him and why his own government not only wasn't helping him, but was causing him to be in this predicament. And he was finally at some point released with virtually no explanation and eventually allowed to return to the United States, where of course he's never been charged with a crime. This happens to me everywhere I go and speak at events like this, not planning, but simply coincidentally confronting people whose lives have truly been devastated by these assaults and injustices that we can speak about a little bit too abstractly sometimes, and that really provides me with the motivation, additional motivation, to continue to work on the battle. Now, one of the things I think is important to do is when we talk about this separate system of justice for Muslims, I think it's important to be specific about what that means. We've heard a lot of examples tonight about how that manifests, but I just want to highlight one in particular that is not really the most significant necessarily, but it's incredibly illustrative to me. It's one I've been writing about fairly frequently of late, and so I just want to highlight it briefly to illustrate what I think is the dichotomy that has arisen in how Muslims are treated. There is a very glittering and prestigious cast of bipartisan officials and former officials in Washington, equally divided between the Republican and Democratic parties by design, who have developed a bizarre and sudden interest in advocating on behalf of the group that the United States calls the NBK, the Iranian dissident group, that the State Department for 20 years or so has formally designated as a foreign terrorist organization. And for some reason, this bipartisan cast of Washington insiders have just suddenly gone around the country speaking about the urgency of removing the NBK from the list of terrorist organizations. People who have displayed zero interest in any of these issues in their entire political careers, in fact, displayed almost no political passion of any kind on any issue, have suddenly decided that this is the most urgent cause that Washington has to confront, to remove this group from the list of foreign terrorist organizations. And as it turns out, the Christian Science Monitor last year revealed that the vast majority of those officials, just coincidentally, have been paid huge fees, $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 to make 5 or 10-minute appearances where they speak, sometimes in person, sometimes by video. And they've met continuously with the leaders of this designated terrorist organization and have coordinated the messaging with these leaders as well. And the reason the NBK is something that they're willing to defend is because the NBK is one of those terrorist organizations that is currently engaged in terrorism that promotes rather than impedes the policy of the United States. NBC reported that they're funded and armed and trained by the State of Israel, that they were responsible for perpetrating this series of assassinations of Iranian nuclear scientists and other explosions on Iranian soil. And so this terrorist organization is one that is working for the United States' interest rather than against, and these individuals are therefore willing to stand up so publicly and not only speak on their behalf, but meet with them in public, attend all sorts of functions in Washington for them. Now, the reason this is so significant is because, as this wall demonstrates, as we've heard already tonight, as most of you probably already know, there are dozens and dozens of Muslims whose names most people don't know, who don't really have any connections in Washington, who have been prosecuted and who are sitting in prison for materially supporting organizations on that very same list by virtue of doing far, far, far less than Howard Dean and N. Rendell and Fran Townsend and Wesley Clark and dozens of other Washington officials are doing for the NBK. And yet it is inconceivable that those individuals will be prosecuted for materially supporting a terrorist organization, even though by every conceivable understanding of what the law is, that's precisely what they're doing. And yet here you have dozens of Muslims who are in prison for decades for exercising pure political free speech, for including a channel that is associated with Hezbollah and a package of cable channels that they were selling in Staten Island, who are now sitting in a federal prison in New York, or for translating documents, as Tarak Mahana did, or from uploading YouTube clips that are critical of the United States government, but because there was some conversations with relatives of people in these organizations, though that is materially supporting terrorist organizations, the standards are radically different. The systems really are completely dichotomized. There is one set of laws and principles for everybody in the United States, and there is a completely separate legal system, an inferior legal system, a much more oppressive legal system, one that knows no boundaries of the Constitution for American Muslims or Muslims in general whose views are perceived to be antithetical to that of United States policy. And what makes it so remarkable is that that really is an extraordinary observation to make, that there is a group of people in the United States who, by virtue of their ethnicity and political views and religious affiliations, are treated fundamentally and radically differently in the one place where equality is supposed to reign, and that is under the law. Now, I just want to talk briefly about the reasons why this happens. What is it that is done to sustain what we all know intrinsically as Americans, that we're all taught inherently from the time we're young, is a complete and radical violation of everything that the country is supposed to guarantee. How does that happen? And how does it happen without triggering any sort of objection or protest, except in isolated circles? And I think that the most critical propagandistic tactic that needs to be understood when thinking about why this happens is the use of the word terrorism, which ever since September 11th is probably the most potent word in the American political lexicon. And what's really amazing about that fact, that the word terrorism is the most potent word in the American political lexicon, is that it is also, in my view, the most ill-defined. It's an incredible paradox. The word that shapes our political discourse, that forms how Americans think about so many critical issues, that determines who goes to prison for decades, is a word that is at the center of so much of what we do, and yet lacks any real definition. You cannot find anybody who can give you a fixed definition of that word, of the word terrorism, in any way that is recognized anywhere in the world, not in any court of law, not in any think tank, and not in any academic institution. And there's actually some interesting scholarship about how the word terrorism came to be, how it became so prominent. There's work that is done at NYU that traces the origins of that word and finds that it was really introduced into world affairs by the State of Israel in the late 1960s and early 1970s, because Israel wanted the world to believe that its conflicts with its neighbors was not just about territorial disputes, but was a universal problem that the West should consider its own battle, that it wasn't just them battling against their neighbors for disputed land, but was a war against terrorism. And the problem with defining that term, that was the quandary from the beginning, was that it was impossible to define the term in a way that would include violence they wanted to include, but that would exclude violence that is routinely done by Israel and the United States. There's just no way to do it. And so the tactic that they used at first was to say, well, terrorism is, lucky us, things that are done only by non-state actors. So if you are a government, you just, by definition, you can't do terrorism. It's a bizarre shield of protection. And yet even that has manifested in all sorts of ways, so that if Muslims target purely military targets, people in Iraq and Afghanistan who have targeted invading armies, they're called terrorists. And yet if the United States government conceives of a military tactic and calls it openly shock and awe, designed to terrorize the population of Baghdad into instant submission, the classic case of terrorism, you could never call that terrorism. It really is a word that, and this is quite amazing, that has no meaning and yet justifies everything. It really is a word that shuts down debate. It is a word that explains so much of what we're here talking about tonight. I know this from experience. If you argue that people shouldn't be tortured, you will hear, well, those are terrorists and we need to get information from them. If you say people shouldn't be put into prison without charges, you'll immediately hear, well, those are terrorists. We need to keep them away from other human beings. If you say the president shouldn't have the power to target American citizens for assassinations without due process, you'll immediately hear, well, he was a terrorist and therefore he had to die. It is the ultimate conversation ender, and people assume that when that label gets applied by the government, there must be some justification to it. It's the reason why so much of this is permitted to take place. Now, the other reason why this is permitted to take place is because the United States government does a very good job of making sure that the terrorism threat continues to exist even when it really doesn't. It's really quite remarkable. You'll hear sports fans in the United States all the time celebrate whenever a team has an undefeated streak. They won 8 in a row, or 9 in a row, or 10 in a row, but the reality is the team that has the best undefeated streak in the United States is the FBI. They are incredibly successful. In fact, they have a 100% success rate at the last minute jumping in and saving the United States from the terrorist plots that the FBI creates and manufactures and funds and drives. They're incredibly good at this. And almost every single significant terrorist attack that the FBI has uncovered in the past 5 to 6 years, has been ones that they've single-handedly concocted. Ones that would not exist without their continuous recruitment and manipulation of typically young Muslims. And the tragedy of that is not just that people who would never have committed a crime, absent that entrapment, end up in prison for decades, although they do. The other tragedy is that it continues to propagandize Americans into believing that this grave threat posed by Americans on our own soil. It's the reason why Americans continue to support these policies and to believe that they're urgent to keep them safe from a threat that really doesn't exist. Now, the last point I want to talk about is the one that I think is actually the most important. And that is thinking about why it is that people are apathetic about the erosion and assault on these most basic liberties, and how it is that they can be persuaded to care as much as the people in this room do. And there's a couple of reasons why people are willing to be apathetic to these developments, in addition to the ones that I just discussed. One is that people perceive that as long as these assaults are directed only at a group of people that is different from them and separate from them, namely those Muslims and their associates and friends, then there's no reason for them to care. As long as they're not affected by it as they perceive it, then there's no reason for them to be concerned about it. And the other reason is that it was the case 4 or 5 years ago that there was much greater divisiveness and controversy over these developments. You heard lots of pretty vociferous debates about Guantanamo and torture and eavesdropping and surveillance. And then a Democrat got elected president and became the person presiding over those policies, and suddenly the controversies really disappeared. You have Republicans in the United States who have always been in favor of these policies, and Democrats who oppose them only so long as there was an opportunistic political gain to be made from pretending to oppose them, who now, because it's a Democrat doing it, no longer feel a reason to object. And so I think these really explain why there's such apathy towards these issues. Now, you know, I think it's incumbent upon everybody to figure out the best way to convince those who think like that why they are actually affected by these developments, even if they think they're not. There's this quote here from Martin Luther King that says that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And there are just people who simply don't believe that. There are some people who simply think that as long as an injustice is over there, it's not actually everywhere. It's only over there. It doesn't affect me. And I'm only going to worry about injustices that directly affect me. And so for people like that, they're probably beyond the pale. You can't convince them that they should care about injustices that aren't affecting them. But what you can do is convince them that those injustices that they think don't affect them actually really do. And one way to do that is to make the not very controversial observation that whenever governments acquire a certain power over their citizenry, it is always the case, not often or sometimes or usually, it is always the case that those powers will be applied beyond their original justification. And you see this happening already in many different cases. The Patriot Act that was justified by the threat of terrorism in the wake of 9/11 has been abused and applied to all sorts of dissident groups in the United States to spy on all sorts of peace groups. You have people like Lynn Stewart, who, although not Muslim, was targeted by the US government because of her brave and intrepid advocacy on behalf of Muslims that the government didn't like. I recently wrote about a filmmaker whose name is Laura Poitras, who has produced 2 documentaries, one of which was nominated for the Academy Award, about showing the devastation that U.S. policy in Iraq and Yemen produces. Every single time she re-enters the country, she's detained at the border. She's questioned extensively, sometimes for hours, about with whom she met and where she went and why she went there. Her laptops and reporters' notebooks and cameras and cell phones are often seized without any warrant and kept for weeks and copied. In other words, her most private communications are invaded. It has already extended wildly beyond its original application, and history proves that it will continue to. So anybody who is content that these abuses will remain confined only to this group is deluding themselves. these abuses spread rapidly and inevitably in ways that people can't predict. But I think the more important point is a little bit difficult to convey, but I think it's extremely important to grapple with, and this is the last point I want to make, is that when you allow civil liberty erosions and the destruction of core freedoms to take hold, what it really does is it changes the relationship between the citizenry and its government. It really creates a climate of fear that imposes a tyranny that is actually more effective than tyrannies that are just overt. And I just want to convey an anecdote, a personal anecdote that I encountered that really highlighted that fact for me in a very visceral way. I've spent a couple of years now writing fairly frequently about WikiLeaks, the group that discloses government secrets in the name of transparency, and I typically write in defense of that group and argue why the prosecution would be a grave threat to press freedoms, and I talk about the promise that I think that group holds. And the first time that I ever wrote about WikiLeaks, actually the first time I ever heard about WikiLeaks, was in January of 2010, more than a couple of years ago now. And this was at a time when almost nobody had heard of this group. It was before they had done any of their news-making disclosures, before they even produced and published the video showing U.S. helicopters in Baghdad gunning down unarmed civilians and Reuters journalists. And the way that I had come to learn about WikiLeaks was that the Pentagon, in 2008, prepared a report that it classified as top secret. And the report said it declared WikiLeaks to be an enemy of the state, an enemy of the United States, and it plotted ways that the Pentagon would work to destroy WikiLeaks. They would fabricate documents and submit them to WikiLeaks so that when WikiLeaks published them, their credibility would be destroyed. It would uncover the identity of their sources so that nobody would feel comfortable leaking to them any longer. It was a report that really said that WikiLeaks was a grave threat to everything that the Pentagon was attempting to achieve. And ironically enough, this report got linked to WikiLeaks, which then published it. And the New York Times wrote a short report about this, a short article about this report, which I read. And I read the report and I read the article, and I saw that the Pentagon had actually set out to destroy WikiLeaks. And I remember at the time thinking that any group that the Pentagon was declaring to be an enemy of the state and was plotting to destroy was one that deserved a lot more of attention and probably a lot of support. So I went and I did a lot of research about what WikiLeaks had done, and I found that they had engaged in all sorts of important disclosures. They had uncovered corruption in Africa on the part of corporations. They had uncovered government deceit in Australia and Norway. I could see that the template and the model was extremely promising to explode the wall of secrecy behind which the US government and its national security state operates. And I wrote a long article about WikiLeaks and the promise that it held. And I interviewed Julian Assange, and I published the interview, the audio of the interview that I had done with him. And at the end of the article, I encouraged people to donate money to WikiLeaks because they had budgetary constraints and they were unable to process some of the important leaks they were sitting on, the ones that they ended up releasing about Iraq and Afghanistan and the diplomatic cables. And I provided a link to their PayPal account, and I gave some information about how people could donate money digitally or wiring into their bank account. And in response to my article, and specifically my encouraging people to donate money to them, I had dozens of people, maybe even hundreds, definitely dozens and dozens of people who said to me basically the same thing. In my comment section to that article, by email, at venues like this, they said, look, and these were American citizens, they said, I am convinced that WikiLeaks holds great promise and is an organization that deserves to be supported. I definitely see that. You convinced me of that. But the problem is I'm actually afraid to donate money to WikiLeaks because I feel like if I donate money to WikiLeaks, especially digitally, then I'm going to end up on a government list somewhere. Or that potentially in the future, if WikiLeaks is declared to be a terrorist organization, I may be subject to criminal liability for providing material support to terrorism. And the reason that was so eye-opening for me, I mean, these were not conspiratorial people prone to paranoia. These were well-rounded, rational people. The reason that was so jarring to me was because these were people who, out of fear of what the United States government could do to them, were voluntarily relinquishing their own core First Amendment freedoms, which is what donating money to a political organization whose cause you support is. It's a right of free speech, a right of free assembly and petition. They were afraid to exercise their own rights. This is the climate of fear that gets created when people know they have a government that does and can cross any lines without any repercussions. And what's so amazing about that is that you can offer all the rights in the world and all the constitutional guarantees you want on a piece of paper or a piece of parchment, but if the government successfully intimidates people through this climate of fear, out of exercising them, those rights become completely meaningless. In December 2010, I wrote an article that was the first article written about the subject, detailing the extremely inhumane and oppressive conditions in which Private Bradley Manning was being detained. He is the accused leaker of most of those documents to WikiLeaks. And I detailed the conditions that the UN high official on torture just 2 months ago concluded after a formal investigation constituted cruel and inhumane punishment. He was subjected to prolonged solitary confinement. He was sadistically subjected to rituals of answering guards' inquiries every 5 minutes. He was barred from exercising in his own cell. The kinds of conditions to which American prisoners are routinely subjected, but much more extreme, and without having ever been charged with, let alone convicted of a crime. And I remember at the time that I wrote the article, I had the question that arose. I found it sort of baffling, and I had a lot of people ask me this question as well, which was, why would the U.S. government possibly want to subject Bradley Manning to these conditions? It seems to be counterproductive, contrary to their interests. For one thing, if he makes statements that are incriminating, it would be difficult to use those statements against him while prosecuting him because they could claim it was coerced. They had created emotional sympathy for him. The Obama administration's own State Department spokesman ended up resigning in protest, and I couldn't really figure out why they would want to do this. And then after thinking about it a little bit longer, I realized that the reason that they subjected Bradley Manning to those kinds of conditions, those brutally inhumane and oppressive conditions, is the same reason that the U.S. government abducted people from around the world and shipped them thousands of miles away to a Caribbean island and dressed them in orange jumpsuits and shackles and showed the world what they had done. It's the same reason the United States continues to kill civilians at will using drones and cluster bombs and other instruments of death. It's the same reason the United States created a regime of torture. It is a way of signaling not only to people outside of the United States, but also to American citizens, that if you are somebody who, like Bradley Manning, discovers things that we've done in secret that are deceitful and illegal and think about exposing it to the world, think twice about it because look what we've done to him. Or if you're somebody who wants to oppose American conduct in the world in any meaningful way, look at this wall of people whom we've consigned to a cage for doing nothing more than what the U.S. Constitution guarantees people the right to do, or look at the corpses that we've created around the world without any repercussions. It's a way of signaling to people that there is no line that we can't cross. There is nothing that we can't do to you without any repercussions. It is a way of intimidating and deterring people out of the right to challenge what the United States government does. There is a real insidiousness to that framework, to that climate of fear, because what ends up happening is people convince themselves that they are free even when they're not. They convince themselves that they don't really want to engage in real dissent. They don't really want to challenge the assertion of power. They don't really want to engage in any meaningful impediment of the United States government because they've been frightened out of doing it. And once they convince themselves that they don't really want to do those things, they don't even realize the assaults on their freedoms because they tell themselves, well, there's nothing I want to do that I'm unable to do. The socialist activist Rosa Luxemburg put it this way. She said, he who does not move does not notice his own chains. He who does not move does not notice his own chains. It is incredibly easy, incredibly effective to put a population into such fear that they no longer even view real dissent as a possibility. And I think that's really the most insidious and most subtle but most significant erosion that has taken place in the United States. And the real danger, as I started off by talking about, is that if these changes become sufficiently normalized, if enough people no longer even realize that there's another way, these changes become irreversible. I think everybody in this room, by virtue of the fact that you're here, doesn't believe that it is yet irreversible. I certainly don't believe it is, but the work to make sure that it doesn't become so is extremely important work. And the coalition, which we're all gathered here to support, is really at the forefront of that fight, and that's why I hope you support that group and continue to support its work as much as I do.
Influential thinker, we know where Glenn stands on civil liberties and the Constitution. It is no wonder that he was ranked in the top half of the Atlantic's 50 most influential pundits. I introduce Dr. Sama Abushir, whose integrity is measured in his actions as much as in his words.
I'll try to share some thoughts with you that will help us highlight and position NCPCF tonight as opposed to our civil freedoms in this country, that will help us to understand the essence of why we're here tonight, because we came for a reason. We did not come here to protect the civil freedoms and the constitutional rights of a single individual. No, we're here to defend and to protect the civil liberties and the constitutional rights of a single community. We're here to defend our values as Americans. We're here to defend our legacy. It's not to defend the Muslim community per se. But the Muslim community has become the parameter and the testing ground of our adherence to these values. Because once you deny the Muslim community in the United States their rights, you're denying the entire country and the entire population and the entire American people of their rights. As we were reminded that injustice anywhere is injustice everywhere. And injustice against one individual is injustice against all. So we're here to stand for what we believe in. We're here to defend America as we love America to be. We're here to defend our Constitution and our rights in this country. You know, our history is an ongoing history of discrimination. A history of discrimination based on religion. A history of discrimination based on denominations. We did discriminate against the Catholics. It's a history of discrimination based on color, as we discriminated against the African Americans. It's a history of discrimination based on ethnicities, as we discriminated against the Japanese Americans. It is a history of discrimination based on ideology, and I think these ideas were presented by Mr. Greenwald when he spoke about the history of America. But on the other hand, our history is a history of self-correction. At this critical point of our history, to be the force that will help self-correct America and the discourse of America. Not to allow injustice to take place again in our names. Not to allow oppression to take place in our names. Not to allow the denial of freedoms and basic values, the human values, to take place in our name and to be practiced in our name. We shouldn't generalize a rule and apply it only to the Muslims, because terrorism is being practiced by all religions, in the name of all religions, in the name of no religion. But we don't say that Christian or Jews or people of no religion are terrorists. What we see that a single individual has violated the law and have committed an act of terrorism. But we want justice for all. For those who we like, those who we dislike. We have to be fair with all. We're here to stand for justice, justice for all. If it wasn't for the efforts of people like Martin Luther King, for the efforts of people like Rosa Parks, we would have not had the opportunity to be here tonight, defending our rights, speaking on behalf of our freedoms, speaking on behalf of our values that we all cherish. It is because of them. They have passed the test, they have done their homework, now it is upon us to finish and to continue this endeavor. So we make sure that America is as we envision it. America that we're all proud of. We're talking about a violation of one of the guiding principles of this country. We're talking about a direct violation of the 4th and the 5th and the 14th Amendment of a due process, the right to have a due process. And no one is talking about it. Just very few are talking about it. The nation is silent because there is sin vis-a-vis us. The same thing was applied to the Catholic because it was them as opposed to us. The same thing was applied to the Irish because it was them as opposed to us. The same thing was against the Jews because it was them against us. The same thing with the blacks, the same thing with the African Americans, the same thing with the communists, the same thing with X and Y and Z. If we will continue to allow this, we will not be proud to be Americans. If the Muslim community, the first target of this campaign of oppression will not step forward, I don't see other communities who don't feel the need coming forward. So I would say to my community, to the Muslim community, to the smaller community, to the immediate community of mine, if we do not come together, do not expect the support of the rest of the larger society in America. We have to show them that we are willing to be the conscience of America today, and we are willing to take this fight upon ourselves until we make sure that freedom will apply to all, inshallah.
I served as a chaplain in Guantanamo back in 2003. Sent to Guantanamo Bay as I was serving the U.S. Army as one of our nation's first Muslim chaplains. And needless to say, down in Guantanamo Bay, what was quite clear is that the prisoners there were not being treated very nicely. They were being subjected to cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment, attacks on personal dignity. They were being persecuted for their faith. Now, whether prisoners here in the United States are in the SHU, the Special Housing Unit, whether they're under Special Administrative Procedures, SAPs, whether they're caged like animals in Guantanamo Bay, it's all the same. They're all being humiliated. And this is what we have to fight against. When I served in Guantanamo Bay and raised objections to the abuse of prisoners down in Guantanamo, that led me to becoming a prisoner. It was instead of listening to my concerns about how prisoners were being tortured that instead the government turned on me. The military, the U.S. military, which I was patriotically serving, turned on me and then threw me in prison and arrested me in secret. After I came from Guantanamo and landed at Jacksonville Naval Air Station, I was arrested in secret after being swarmed by customs officials, immigration officers, the FBI, Army counterintelligence, naval criminal investigators. Nobody knew what had happened to me. I didn't make my connecting flight to Seattle to meet my wife and daughter. It was like I had disappeared in America. I was thrown into solitary confinement for 76 days. First in Jacksonville and then transported to the Consolidated Naval Brig down in Charleston, South Carolina, where there were 3 other noted enemy combatants being held there. Jose Padilla, Yasser Hamdi, Salah Al-Mari, those names are also up there. But I was in that prison for 76 days. When I was transported there, I was shackled at the wrists, at the waist, at the ankles, in a suit of chains, in the same exact way that they chained prisoners in Guantanamo Bay. I was thrown into the back of a truck, next to an armed guard, who then proceeded to put over my eyes these plastic goggles that were black, over my ears these devices to prevent me from hearing. I was subjected to what is called sensory deprivation. I couldn't hear, I couldn't see. I was shackled like the prisoners in Guantanamo, and at that point, I understood what was happening to me. The fear, the intimidation, that my own government also would potentially be stripping from me all of my rights, all of my freedoms. That was the predicament I was in. I was in that jail cell for 76 days. solitary confinement, strip search daily. I didn't do much of this sitting around because my head was spinning. My mind was going crazy. I was walking in circles, wondering what was going to happen to me, when I would get the death penalty, as I was threatened with by military prosecutors. I was accused very publicly while I was in prison of spying, espionage, aiding the enemy, mutiny and sedition, all which are capital crimes. They told me they were going to give me the death penalty. In the end, all of the accusations that were brought against me would be dropped. I was released from prison. My record was wiped clean, after which I tendered my resignation from the U.S. military, receiving an honorable discharge in January of 2005. Since my departure from the military, my focus has been on fighting for civil liberties, defending human rights, and that's why I'm here tonight. Because the coalition, the National Coalition to Protect Civil Freedoms, is an organization that is bold enough to take on these cases of preemptive prosecution. We need to protect our freedoms. We need to advocate for those who are being abused in our prison system. And we need to continue to advocate for due process. Even after you get out of the prison, the torture doesn't end. You have antidepressants. You have anti-anxiety medications, sleep medications, to try and get your life back to normal. You suffer from post-traumatic stress. The only thing that helps me is coming to these events where I try to make a difference. And I often say that what happened to me, I don't want to happen to anyone else. But that's too late, because we see the number of people that it's already happened to. And it continues to happen even today. So we have to step up. I want everyone to remember the cause, to remember what has to be done, what needs to be done, and to remember what has already been done by this organization, the National Coalition to Protect Civil Freedoms. Let's keep it strong, let's grow it stronger, and let's change this country for the better.